Welcome to a new episode of Film Seizure at the Movies. I'm Geoff Arbuckle, co-host of the Film Seizure podcast that you can catch each Wednesday morning with my cohorts Jason Oliver and Chuck Moore, and my solo show Monster Mondays that you can listen to each Monday afternoon. You can catch both of these shows at filmseizure.com. We have a couple more movies in to kind of look at here in recent release. We have The Black Phone starring Ethan Hawke as a kidnapper and generally creepy kind of guy, and the sort of unexpected return of Beavis and Butt-Head in the feature-length adventure as they do the universe. And that first movie that we're going to talk about is Beavis and Butt-Head Do the Universe, which is currently streaming on Paramount+. And of all the pop culture hits of the early to mid-90s, things like grunge music acts like Pearl Jam and Nirvana's subsequent band from their drummer Dave Grohl, the Foo Fighters, TV shows like The Simpsons, Friends, and Seinfeld that still have a pretty vibrant life within fan communities, or actually still releasing new stuff like with The Simpsons, I never quite expected Beavis and Butt-Head to be one of those things that would still exist 30 years on. In the 90s, the thing about Beavis and Butt-Head that was so of their moment could be determined by two things that made up their show on MTV. The first is that they were a younger generation reacting to a previous generation's style of pop music while still kind of just sitting on their couch and watching MTV. And the second element of their show was the interaction that the pair of slackers had with the world at large and their seemingly stupid misunderstanding of the world around them. There are few current pop culture things that, for example, my dad still, kind of picked up on and still kind of remember fondly. In fact, in my life, there were probably only two things that started in my generation that struck a chord with my dad: The Simpsons and Beavis and Butt-Head. And I wouldn't necessarily say that he was a super fan of Beavis and Butt-Head, but he certainly found their antics to be funny most of the time. And like with The Simpsons being kind of the same era, Beavis and Butt-Head's creator Mike Judge made them kind of these sort of average dolts that you would find in any town or city. Their narrow view of the world around them made them do and say stupid and funny things, whether it was teasing classmate Daria, who herself ended up getting a spinoff on MTV in the later part of the 90s, or their Dennis the Menace-like relationship with their neighbor, Mr. Anderson. Beavis and Butt-Head were kind of really only living for the moment and in a sort of way striking out against normality in their own kind of special and stupid way. And that's what made the show kind of smart. First of all, I find Mike Judge to be a very good writer and creator. He instills a lot of heart and intelligence into his stuff like Beavis and Butt-Head and his major Fox series, King of the Hill, that I still think is a very, very well-written, well-created, and well-crafted show. What was created with these two teenage slacker idiots was something of a little larger than their dumb antics. In one regard, it was MTV kind of taking on the blame and owning the fact that these two kids were absolutely the MTV generation. They were couch potatoes, lazy and snarky about stuff from the past. That's what a lot of people complained about my generation. And it's what a lot of people in my generation complain about the subsequent generation that came after us. It's a common thing, right? However, Mike Judge was smart enough to also kind of instill that, much like with Bart Simpson at the same time, these kids might be stupid, but they were kind of a product of the world of that time. They might be slackers, yes. They might be wildly inconsiderate, sure. And they definitely did delinquent things, but you could argue that they were surviving well enough somehow. They weren't really anything different than what other generations had within it as they were growing up. They just had access to different things and lacked other things that might make a difference in their upbringing and immersion to their surroundings. That's all. And like I said, if anything, They were maybe more of a product of the world, of what the world was in the 90s, as this pair of latchkey kids who probably got left behind by a society and educators that wouldn't or couldn't try to help them. Ooh, I probably got a little too deep in the social commentary of Beavis and Butt-Head, but anyway, it's not all that surprising that Beavis and Butt-Head was MTV's top show during their initial run between 1993 and 1997. Remember, this was during a time in which MTV still primarily showed music videos during their broadcast day. It's also kind of interesting that while a major part of their show was about poking fun at the videos MTV used to air, that they were the beginning of that shift in programming at the station that come about 10 years after the series ended would be almost all programming and very little discussion of music, or let alone showing videos. Beavis and Butt-Head propelled MTV into the 90s and found ground with younger Gen Xers and older millennials, while also paving the way for the channel to not be what it used to be, up to and including the time that the show aired. It was both a savior of sorts and a murderer of sorts, and that almost seems befitting Beavis and Butt-Head. All right, so just in time for Christmas in 1996, Beavis and Butt-Head Do America came to theaters, and it was mostly well received by critics and audiences, doing just over $63 million against the $12 million budget. I find it funny that it was nominated for an MTV Movie Award for Best Duo, but lost. They can't even get respect from their home network, I guess. But I do find it very funny that the Razzies, a ceremony that I think has gone on for way too long now, nominated the fairly likable film for Worst New Stars and Worst Screen Couple. I mean, come on, Razzies. I mean, in a way, I guess maybe it was them kind of awaringly kind of doing that and saying, oh, look, they are a stupid pair of kids. Let's nominate them for this. But I have a feeling it's not that. And they really probably should get a sense of humor that doesn't involve just punching at things that are trendy to punch at. I recommend the Razzie grow some balls and watch truly awful movies and nominate those instead. But here we are, 25 years since the last season of the original run of Beavis and Butt-Head, and they are still alive and well as a property that Paramount Plus keeps on their streaming platform. So much so, in fact, it's time to send the dummy duo to the stars and Beavis and Butt-Head Do the Universe. This was a COVID-19 production. The entire production was conducted via Zoom. So welcome to the future, Beavis and Butt-Head. What was old is new, and what's new is old. But the movie opens in 1998 at the Highland High School Science Fair, and I can't not exactly explain how at home I suddenly felt by watching Butt-Head just repeatedly kick Beavis in the junk over and over and over again, just to see how long it would take for Beavis to pass out. It just amazingly felt warm and fuzzy immediately. But all of this kicking in the balls and trying to figure out whether or not Beavis is going to pass out at a certain point, that's not their science fair project. Nope. It's just a bunch of nad kicking. They just happen to be in the room where the science fair is taking place. But after destroying the entire science fair, a judge who had just learned a lesson from watching an episode of Touched by an Angel decides to go easy on the pair of ne'er-do-wells and send them to space camp to be given a chance at learning something. And at space camp, their brilliance at the controls of the docking procedures for a part of the space shuttle to dock with the Russian Mir space station, which looks like a giant dick going into Mir's vaginal docking port. They prove themselves to be the perfect candidates to actually go on a space mission to do the actual docking of the real space shuttle to Mir. Now, believing that they're going to score with the female captain astronaut on the mission, they go on the training, passing with somewhat flying colors, so dedicated to the idea of scoring with an actual woman. It's a really funny sequence. Maybe the best part is watching Beavis barf in zero-G freefall in that kind of zero-G airplane training thing. It's hilarious. There are several sequences of this movie that are absolutely hilarious, but they go into space. That's right. Beavis and Butt-Head are actually in space. Now, thanks to pointing the space shuttle's telescope directly at the sun and burning their eyes out, they don't succeed in the docking. In fact, they destroy the mirror, creating an international incident and irreparably damaging the shuttle. Now, the pair get flung out into space and get sucked into a black hole where they emerge in Texas of 2022. The governor of Texas is the captain of the space shuttle mission that the boys think they still have a mission to score with. After a visit from multiversal versions of themselves, dubbed Smart Beavis and Smart Butt-Head, they learn that they must be returned to their proper time and space, but of course, they don't really pay attention to themselves. There's a whole sequence of this movie that ultimately turns into something like Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas in a hotel room where, after constantly ordering and eating nothing but nachos and wrecking the hotel room, it's just fantastic. But in a later sequence, they learn about white privilege at college, and it goes over just about as well as you might expect. While you could say that the 85-minute runtime at times could feel a bit long, it's rather surprising that 25 plus years along, Beavis and Butt-Head is still funny. While the movie does go on, like I said, a little too long at times, but once it ramps back up to a funny scene and it picks everything back up really, really well. It's funny because I think the secret to Beavis and Butt-Head has always been, you know what the joke is going to be. It's telegraphed the entire way. And yet, when the joke happens, you still laugh at it. It's still funny. But of all the jokes, the recurring one that I really liked the best in the movie were the multiversal Smart Beavis and Smart Butt-Head that show up to try to have the regular dumb Beavis and Butt-Head travel through a portal to fix both of their universes. It's just, it's so, it's so stupid. And it's one of those times where you feel stupid laughing at some of the jokes, but they're just so perfect. And it's just so funny how oddly Beavis and Butt-Head fit in with 2022. Overall, Beavis and Butt-Head Do the Universe has a familiar feel that isn't a negative. It's a fun watch. If you grew up in the 90s or appreciated the original show, you'll likely at least get a kick out of the jokes that work really, really well. It's a movie that just simply feels good, and it was handled right. And while there is absolutely fan service, like with the entire Cornholio sequence after Beavis downs a bunch of pills instead of hiding them in jail, it doesn't feel forced. It takes something familiar and does something kind of new with it, which is really what a sequel should do. We could easily split hairs on whether or not this is a masterpiece, but I can still say that I have affection for not just this movie, but for these characters. It definitely made me feel warmer and fuzzier than other nostalgia grabs lately, like Lightyear or Jurassic World Dominion or the most recent Texas Chainsaw Massacre movie. All right, so let's now switch gears to something completely different than Beavis and Butt-Head. Ethan Hawke in The Black Phone. Now, The Black Phone comes from Scott Derrickson, whose credits include the first Doctor Strange movie and some quite high-profile current horror films like The Exorcism of Emily Rose, the first two Sinister movies, Sinister 1 and 2, and Deliver Us from Evil. The Black Phone doesn't just have a high-profile director, writer, and producer like Derrickson, but it also comes from a short story written by Joe Hill. Hill comes from a pretty significant lineage, being the son of a guy named Stephen King. And all this is tied together by Jason Blum and Blumhouse Productions. I wanted to start with that lead-in because let's break this all apart. Derrickson, while I would say not every one of his credits are massive hits with me, he's still a guy who I think really understands how to make scary movies. Sinister is considered one of the scariest movies, at least of the last 20 years, if not longer. He's got a little bit of vision. Blumhouse every year has 2 or so movies that are their bigger budgeted, bigger attention grabbing movies thrown in the mix of their smaller, not as impressive movies, but they know they are basically kind of the leaders right now in horror. But with Joe Hill, you get not only his masterful storytelling and characters, but you also get to have a little bit of fun and play around with a little bit of his dad's tropes as well. So, let's talk about the movie itself. The Black Phone is set in 1978 during a particularly harrowing few months in which various school-age boys have gone missing after being grabbed by a guy in a black van with black party balloons that the press has dubbed the Grabber. We mostly follow siblings Finney and his younger sister Gwen. Now, Finn is consistently dodging bullies at school. And we'll come back around to those bullies here in just a moment. But Gwen is the tougher, harder-edged of the two. But there's something else that she has that is quite interesting. She seemingly has inherited some abilities from her deceased mother. Both Gwen and her mother have visions in their dreams. Visions that often foretell the kidnappings perpetrated by the Grabber. Now, this world is almost up and down, left to right, a Stephen King world. I could imagine this being in the same universe as It or Pet Sematary. While this takes place in and around a suburb of Denver, Colorado, it looks wet, kind of cold, and gray like New England in the fall or early winter, which would be right in where Stephen King's stories take place. Now, there are people like Finn and Gwen's father who are brutally bad people. Although I will say that Finn and Gwen's father does have an arc of his own kind of happening in the background of this movie. But since their mother's suicide after being overwhelmed by her powers, their father drinks heavily. When Gwen garners the attention of the local police because she's told people of her dreams, their father, Terrence, beats her mercilessly with his belt to force her to never again tell anyone about her dreams and try to make her denounce what she sees. Then there are the bullies. Holy shit, this town is hard on kids. Finn has no less than 4 kids who have either beaten him up before the movie starts or beat him up during the movie. Now, there's a friend of his who sticks up for him, who also wails on a different kid, before the school day even starts. Another instance in which Finn is attacked once his friend goes missing involves Gwen not just bashing one kid in the head with a rock, causing him to look stupefied and bleeding heavily from the head, but to get back at her for doing that to their friend, the other 2 bullies kick her repeatedly in the gut and once across the face. Then the kids just go to school and sit in first period like everything is normal day-to-day business. There are times where I'm thinking, oh my God, these kids in this town. I mean, what is going on here? But this ties to another Stephen King trope. The adults at times seem to only be barely looking after the safety of the children in this town. There's a part in which Finn, once he does inevitably get grabbed by the Grabber, escapes and makes enough noise for people in the neighborhood where he's being held to turn on their porch light, but no one opens their door or seems to even attempt to see what's going on outside. It's like in the story It, when the adults consistently turn their backs to things that are happening to the kids of Derry, Maine. So sure, when a kid goes missing, some people band together and go on a search for kids, but it also seems as though people fairly quickly dissipate and lose interest and no longer really join in on the search, leaving the parents of those missing kids to really stick missing persons announcements on the telephone poles, and that's really it. It's a pretty depressing place. Now, I haven't said too much about what I actually thought about the movie outside of drawing the thematic connections, the stuff that felt recognizable, but this is a very good movie. I will go so far as to bet that this will be the absolute best horror thriller of this year. Every now and then, a horror movie comes along that is incredibly engaging, and you're not only invested in how this kid is going to get away from his captor, but you actually feel like that kid trapped in that basement. And not only that, but you could also kind of say that you also potentially feel like you feel that desperation that his sister felt when she's trying to find him or interpret her dreams in some sort of helpful way. But this isn't just engaging, it becomes engrossing. There are a couple of really good jump scares too that work perfectly to help you understand that, you know, whenever this black phone that is oddly found in the same room Finn is being kept, is a way for Finn to learn from the past victims who are now ghostly voices coming through the phone telling him what they attempted and tried in order to escape, that ultimately helps him figure out how to defeat and escape the grabber. They aren't just ghostly voices, but they're also ghostly visages in the room too. It's creepy, but it's also building to a great conclusion by building up Finn's character. It's marvelous. Now, Ethan Hawke is also extremely disturbing. We don't know too much about the grabber. In fact, we don't ever learn anything beyond what Finn could possibly know about him by being his captive. And that's really intelligent. It gives Hawke a chance to give us his character through a performance, not just an exposition dump. He's maybe got a broken psyche or possibly multiple personality disorder, because depending on what devil mask he's wearing in the scenes that he has, we get a different version of this guy, from soft-spoken and almost kind of naively childlike to brutal and almost a similar abusive figure like Finn and Gwen's father. It's a solid performance behind a mask and with limited time on screen. So in all, I kept getting these reminders of something like Silence of the Lambs. You feel the tension building. You get a similar color palette. You have a chance to journey through the movie with a main character and see this main character really have a transformation. In this case, it's, you know, Finn going from this kid who gets picked on to being a kid who ultimately will no longer take anyone's shit anymore. Comparing it to Silence of the Lambs, Starling's transformation from FBI cadet to the person who brought down Buffalo Bill, you know, you can really kind of feel that same thing in Finn's arc. This is a really great movie. And I highly recommend both The Black Phone and Beavis and Butt-Head Do the Universe. I think The Black Phone in particular will be considered a modern classic in horror. Oh, and before I wrap things up, both of these movies, as different as they were, have one thing in common. Both movies have someone call another character a fart knocker. That could easily explain why both of these movies get a high recommendation from me. But don't forget to follow Film Seizure at Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram so you can be made aware of new episodes of our various shows as they drop. You can also follow us at podcast providers like SoundCloud, Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, TuneIn, Stitcher, Spotify, and Audible. You can also listen to the show on YouTube, and you can subscribe to us there. Now, I'll be back next weekend with a look at the new Marvel Studios release from Taika Waititi and starring Chris Hemsworth, Natalie Portman, and Christian Bale, Thor, Love and Thunder, and I'll also give a quick little mid-year recap too. So until then, don't forget to save me the aisle seat.